For more than a quarter of a century, ITV were the only game in town as far as commercial broadcasting in the UK was concerned. In 1982, Channel 4 showed up, but even they were affiliated with the IBA for their first decade. More pressingly, around the same time, a whole new frontier was opening up. With the traditional UHF broadcasting space almost full, cable and satellite were about to bypass those limitations altogether, with new channels out the ears, either transmitted underground or via signals beamed into space and bounced back to Earth. Most of these early services hit the same snag, that if you're going to have a million new channels, you will need to put programs on them, and for preference, programs that anyone in the entire world actually wants to watch. Eventually, one company emerged victorious: Sky. And boosted by the exclusive rights to top-flight football, they became the behemoths of British television. The future was multi-channel, and the establishment knew it. The existing companies had to expand or die. While the BBC trod carefully, investing in UK Gold and the network it later spawned, before explicitly diving in under their own name, for ITV this was a very different world. It had been an almost infinitesimally narrower broadcasting landscape when they'd been born. The pond was now an ocean. How big of a fish were they going to be?
Seven,
6, 5,
4, 3,
2, 1.
7 new channels.
Launching on your TV.
On October 1st, 1996.
From the biggest in satellite.
Sky TV.
From the biggest on ITV.
Granada Television.
7 Up.
7 Alive.
7 made with you in mind.
Well, thank God for the Broadcasting Act 1990. The wholesale deregulation of the ITV network meant that for the companies that made it up, everything was now up for grabs, including each other, leading to a massive competitive game of Katamari Damacy, as larger companies hoovered up the smaller ones, each vying to impress the king of all cosmos with the size of their balls. Well, apt metaphor. In 1996, Granada were ITV's biggest producers of network content, a fact further boosted by their having taken over LWT. With Yorkshire Tidies also heading into their quiver, the time was right to slip the surly bonds of old-fashioned franchise television and move into the brave new world of satellite. Not to mention the forthcoming digital platform as well. Sky were also looking to expand, but then they always are, and always will be, even when they've expanded to the point where they consumed all the energy and mass of the universe, which they inevitably will. Having annihilated their IBA-sanctioned rivals BSB in a terrifying victory for bloodthirsty, borderless neoliberalism over national public service broadcasting, they were now massive, the biggest thing in British television. So of course, they wanted to get bigger.
This is Sky One, a part of the British Sky Broadcasting Network.
Now they could afford to start a few more channels, grow a few more tendrils. They had a moral obligation to their shareholders to do so. Granada came along at exactly the right time for both companies, and the pact was sealed at the very end of 1995 to form the joint venture Granada Sky Broadcasting, or GSB, or GSkyB, as it was also known over Granada's objections.
3,
2, 1.
7 new channels.
Launching on your TV.
On October 1st, 1996.
The deal initially involved 8 new channels. This was later pared down to 4, with one of them becoming a gestalt. This was Granada Good Life, essentially the family circle network, and one of the linchpins of the whole deal, the main place to go for original programming. Obviously that's original in the sense of being newly made, not in the sense of being original. Good Life consisted of 4 substations at different times of the day, mostly following a half-assed this and that pattern. Regardless of the time of day, it was perpetual daytime television hell. There was Home and Garden for your DIY and weed killer tips, Health and Beauty for your loose women / this morning fix, Food and Wine to make that microwave ready meal seem even more like society's punishment for being lonely, and the watchdog aping Granada TV High Street for the angrier failures. The latter was apparently so unprepossessing that no publicly viewable footage of it seems to exist, outside of this pre-launch promo video. Completing the this and that motif, but on its own channel, was Granada Men and Motors. This essentially anticipated the 21st century incarnation of Top Gear, right down to its faces.
This, though, is not the first time that Lotus have had a hand up a Proton's frock. The sparkly little Satria GTI boasts Lotus underpinnings, and that goes like a scalded ferret down a sprinter's shorts. It is quick.
Except that it skipped the opening few series when it was good, and went straight to its leering, pre-epic, self-satisfied, racist later years. There was also Granada Talk TV, Britain's first dedicated talk show channel, which sounds to me like being trapped in the departure lounge of an airport with the same 8 bickering couples for the rest of your life. This was mostly notable for launching the careers of Natasha Kaplinsky and Sacha Baron Cohen. The latter presented the Daily Kids show in the manner of a terrifying Middle Eastern elemental hosting the Big Breakfast.
Here with the first ever F2F! I'm filming it, I'm videoing it, I'm going to show it to my parents. This is history. We've been boo, 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 give us some noises, give me some noise. Oh, yes! Hello! I like that little, fantastic little ratter. Hello, I'm Sacha Baron Cohen and welcome to F2F, the first show on British television where every day you get to make the programme, yes?
The former was the Glamour Stooge on the Paul Ross show, which is undeniably worse than being the Glamour Stooge for the Daily Mail, along with most other female newsreaders to this very day. Still, at least it had in-vision continuity, albeit the most oddly bleak in-vision continuity I've ever seen.
At 3 o'clock we had Showbiz UK with Andrea Boardman. Today she's talking to Jason Don. Now you might have seen him snogging on The English Patient. Well, now he's PC Brian Rainford in LWT's smash hit Woken Well. On the show also...
I don't know what it is, but there's something oddly desperate and needful about it. With that tiny space, I get the feeling he's trapped and being forced to read links at gunpoint. I feel like ordering a chopper to airlift him to safety.
All very, very good reasons to stay tuned to Talk TV.
But the flagship GSkyB channel was undoubtedly Granada Plus. With UK Gold having rehabilitated the concept of repeats, everyone with a back catalogue was falling over themselves to get space to re-air them on satellite, with all new adverts and everything. Granada Plus understandably consisted of old episodes of Coronation Street, The Comedians and Crown Court from the Granada archives, plus the likes of On the Buses and Two's Company from the newly acquired LWT. Plus was easily and probably inevitably the most successful GSkyB channel of all, and actually benefited from Granada's continual franchise gobbling. The acquisition of Yorkshire Tyne Teas allowed them to add classic Emmerdale to classic Coronation Street, alongside the likes of the Beiderbecke trilogy and about 58 hours worth of Catherine Cookson adaptations, while Anglia provided them with Survival and Sale of the Century. Eventually they were even buying up old BBC programmes, albeit the ones that few remembered and fewer still actually wanted to see ever again. And as far as the idents went, as you've seen, they were mostly identical, centering around that squared oval G, a loose combination of the Granada and Sky logos of the time, minus the arrow, which Granada obviously really wanted to become iconic, and didn't. In hindsight, it probably isn't surprising that Granada Plus was almost the only one of these 7 in 4 channels that anyone actually bothered watching. The first to fall off the cliff of mass public indifference was Talk TV, which lasted less than a year. Oddly enough, it died with the Princess of Wales. The station was replaced with rolling Sky News coverage on August 31st, 1997, and then never came back again. And no one noticed. Good Life was the next to go, its 4 personalities consolidated into one under the name Granada Breeze. Daytime TV for the genuinely desperate. The newly rechristened Breeze was then forced to flat-share with Men and Motors, which, much to Granada's dismay, had been the only other station that anyone stayed with for longer than it took to push the next channel button on the remote. This newly consolidated GSkyB package of 3 stations on 2 channels stabilised somewhat, and just in time. But before I can go forward, I have to go back to just prior to the launch of GSkyB. While Granada were hatching deals with Sky, their fellow region gobblers Carlton were looking on covetously. At the time the GSkyB deal was being put together, ravenous conglomerate Pearson were adding production company Select TV to their portfolio. Select TV had also run a minuscule cable channel of the same name, in which Pearson either weren't interested or were prescribed from keeping. Enter Carlton. Not exactly a partnership with Sky, but it was a foothold. Before the end of the year, Carlton had already muscled into Select TV's downtime with the Carlton Food Network. Riding the mid-90s wave of cookery shows, a dizzying period when it seemed like every 3rd new commission involved an egg whisk. Initially it was on for a paltry 5 hours a day, noon till 5, until 1997, when its hours were extended from 9 till 5, and where Select TV once was, now sat Carlton Select. Basically the same idea as Granada Plus, only with a far smaller back catalogue. Fortunately for Carlton, they owned Central by now, which made Carlton Select at times like living in Birmingham circa 1989. They also had the old Select TV portfolio, which in terms of things people might actually want to watch, basically amounted to a fistful of Marks and Grand sitcoms and Pie in the Sky.
Simple Simon's Pet of Pirates going to the fair.
No, not that one. The idents, however, was certainly superior to any of Granada's. The jaw-dropping relaunch of BBC Two by Martin Lambie-Nairn and Company, and in fact even before then the brilliant tableau created for BSB by Pentagram, had kicked off a minor but real vogue in mid-90s television design for want of a better phrase, faintly surreal representationalism. Sadly, after BBC Two, these were really only seen off the beaten track. We never got to see, say, Anglia represented by a reflection in a mirror shattering backwards in slow motion or anything. When the CFN Select Alliance didn't collapse after a year, they were joined by 3 further channels. Carlton Cinema saw random movies squeezed painfully into a tiny space because widescreen TV had only just been invented. The audience for Carlton Kids, such as it was inevitably made up almost exclusively of 20 to 40-year-olds who remembered these shows from their own childhoods. And finally there was Carlton World, whose purpose was never clear, but which had the best idents of all. I love this kind of thing, centred on real props and in-camera effects. I've eulogised about this before, but anyone can build impossible things with a computer. But to use real objects with real weight and dimension, and only then take them to CGI world in post-production, that really does make a difference. It adds an extra, undefinable touch, reminiscent of the work of the late Storm Thorgerson and Hypnosis. At their best, they created, within reality, a split second in which an impossible image could exist. And idents like these, or Lambie-Nairns for BBC Two, pulled off the same trick. It's just a shame about the station, really, because Carlton World seemed to exist mostly for the sake of it. Its programming was largely factual, but beyond that, the main difference between it and Carlton Select was the odd original programme, or more often, newer repeats. Admittedly, that's only as far as I can tell, because very little of Carlton World remains to this day. It must be one of the least remarked upon channels in British television history, and an almost criminal waste of really good idents.
It's hot.
Is this true?
It's happening.
Very good.
It's where it's at.
Along with kids, Carlton World was the first against the wall, with both channels dying in 2000 after barely more than a year, which was a shame for them, as they and cinema had been launched as Carlton's best foot forward in their brand new partnership.
Drama.
Now's your chance.
Carlton Kid.
Backtrack again to early 1997. Digital television was just around the corner, marking the transition of multi-channel TV from decadent imperial luxury to the commonplace default it is today. 6 digital terrestrial multiplexes were set up. Don't ask me what a multiplex is. And then divided in half, with 3 of them going to the extant broadcasters, and the other 3 being, you guessed it, auctioned off, in a slightly uncomprehending echo of the by now practically vestigial ITV franchise system. This was perfect timing for both Carlton and Granada, both having just entered the multi-channel world, although unlike Carlton, Granada had already been burnt. On top of that, ITV itself was increasingly dominated by the 2 companies, to the extent that a merger seemed inevitable, and was. The obvious thing to do was to pool their resources together. Their ace in the hole was the third partner, Sky. Their collusion, ostensibly as part of GSkyB, was key to the consortium's plans. Sky, by then an unstoppable juggernaut, would otherwise have been their main rivals. Worse yet, Sky were going to broadcast their digital signals via their satellite system, technologically far superior to shonky old digital terrestrial. It was like giving a head start to Usain Bolt, and so Granada and Carlton were very glad to have Sky on their side. Apart from anything else, Sky agreed to allow them to include the flagship Sky channels in their package at a discount. They even let them base the new company out of Marco Polo House, which they'd inherited from their humiliated, defeated rivals BSB. This should have been taken as an omen. And so the 3 of them won the license to broadcast multi-channel television via digital terrestrial what's-named thing machine. But with one disastrous condition. Sky had to bugger off. Their presence in both camps violated competition regulations. This makes legal sense and all, but it also basically killed off the terrestrial service before it even had a chance to start. Because there are only 2 things Sky could be to the consortium: a menacing partner or a terrifying enemy. And the ITC, for it was they, had just ruled out the former. Now all bets were off. Sky still had to let their flagship stations go out on the new service, but there would be no discounts. Full price. An extra 60 million quid a year. Worse than that, there was nothing stopping Sky from pulling out all the stops to destroy them, just as they had with BSB. Only worse, because back then they were struggling just as much as their rivals, whereas now it was like Ricky Hatton going up against the planet Jupiter. The new service was launched in November 1998 and christened On Digital. initially playing down the ITV connection, even though it was blatantly modelled on what the two big companies were doing with ITV at the time. This ultimately futile attempt at disassociation might have been behind the delayed launch, a mere 3 weeks after On Digital, of ITV2. ITV2, of course, was entirely free to air, and not affiliated with On Digital in any way, apart from having been created by Carlton and Granada, who you'd think would have enough on their plates with their own channels, but then it wasn't like anyone was watching them. And sure enough, ITV2 was created in a blaze of publicity and then just sort of left to spin its wheels while everyone tried to figure out what its purpose was. It still exists to this day, and we're still not really sure what its purpose is. We had On Digital in my house from around about the middle of 1999, figuring we'd need some kind of digital television someday, and that we'd only get Sky if we had absolutely no choice whatsoever short of Nazi television. Also, it was cheaper, in cost if not value. It was a pretty okay service in and of itself, but Sky's was obviously and noticeably better. Incredibly noticeably, because their advertising campaign was expensive, ubiquitous and aggressive, and ultimately unbeatable. Not that On Digital didn't help them out by making mistakes. Their PR was largely directed by Carlton's Director of Corporate Affairs, David Cameron. So, yeah. Well, one completely non-partisan point, a PR man needs at least some imagination. Especially if he's going up against a colossal rampaging kaiju like Sky. All On Digital could think of was a free set-top box with every TV campaign at Curry's, and Sky doused that one by simply offering the same thing. But I'd like to think even David Cameron would know better than to offer On Digital's smaller package for almost the exact same price as Sky's much wider and more reliable one. And then there was the policy of subcontracting the actual installation of the software to about 10 million local companies, which was intended to save the company money, but predictably turned out to be a logistical nightmare that ultimately cost them just as much, if not more, than if they'd done it themselves in the first place. I don't know if George Osborne came up with that one, but I wouldn't be surprised. By 2001, over a quarter of their subscribers had bailed out. Their original channels were dying on their arse. Carlton Kids and Carlton World disintegrated in 2000, and Select followed them off On Digital shortly afterwards, although it carried on cable. Meanwhile, Food Network was now called Taste CFN, in a doomed attempt to stay afloat via a deal with Sainsbury's. Taste CFN was done by Christmas, leaving just Carlton Select and Carlton Cinema, neither of which could be seen outside of On Digital or whatever was left of traditional cable. Granada's stations, of course, could still be seen on the Sky platform, thanks to the desiccated remains of the original GSkyB alliance, but it didn't make much difference. They'd already all but given up on Breeze, flinging a load of psychic bollocks and or daytime American imports on the screen until it finally collapsed and died of exhaustion in April 2002. By then, however, it did have the dubious distinction of being the last channel to use the Granada name, as ITV had gone fully generic, and the word had been dropped from its sister stations to leave the rather stunted-sounding Plus and the still inexplicably popular Men and Motors. These were their flagships, and the ones which weren't already driftwood had run aground. Meanwhile, ITV was barely remarked upon at all. The obvious thing to do was relaunch, and the obvious thing to relaunch as was ITV Digital. Scottish, UTV and even Channel cried foul over the name, but with every region in the country, including them, having the same terrible idents, the writing was very much on the wall. The big draw this time was to be football. lower league football, for which they paid hundreds of millions of pounds that they didn't have and ultimately never saw again. Oh, and the Premiership highlights, which they had to learn the hard way were never major box office, and weren't very good at anyway. Even a stuffed monkey with the voice of Ben Miller yelling at Johnny Vegas didn't help.
Yes, you really are the funniest man in that chair.
And ITV Digital lasted less than a year before disappearing down the massive plug hole that was the £315 million deal with the Football League.
ITV Digital today applied to be put into administration, saying it could no longer afford to pay out the millions of pounds it owes in football rights. The Football League warns that if it doesn't pay up, a third of its clubs could go bankrupt.
With literally no money whatsoever, they were found in breach of contract, kicked in the arse and left in the gutter to die.
Following the recent news about ITV Digital, the BBC would like to reassure ITV Digital customers that they will still be able to watch all the BBC's digital channels on their equipment.
Bleeding and exhausted, Granada and Carlton concentrated on finally merging together to create ITV plc, a much more solid foundation for expansion. Carlton Select and Carlton Cinema stumbled on for a few more years on what remained of cable and the new digital terrestrial platform Freeview. But their only hope of long-term survival was to get on Sky. GSkyB preferred to twist the knife. Talks broke down, their fate was sealed, and the last Carlton channels finally expired in March 2003.
Carlton Cinema thanks all our viewers for tuning in over the last 4 years.
We hope you've enjoyed watching the films as much as we've enjoyed bringing them to you.
Plus survived another 18 months before being abruptly murdered to make way for the near-identical ITV3. And I mean abruptly. Transmission ceased halfway through an episode of Pie in the Sky. Carlton and Granada had just become ITV plc, and there was no room for hazily branded links to the past like Plus. There was, however, still room for Men and Motors, the longest-lived of all the ITV spin-off channels. The transition to ITV4 had appeared, and was, inevitable from the attosecond of the PLC's birth. But people irritatingly kept watching the damn thing. So ITV4 was launched in place of the completely extraneous ITV News channel instead. Men and Motors continued for a further 5 years until its audience finally evaporated, much to ITV's relief. So what did we learn from all this? Absolutely bloody nothing. Well, nothing we didn't know already. Hindsight is 2020, Sky are invincible. Paying hundreds of millions of pounds for the rights to show Grimsby vs Millwall is not a sound business strategy, even if you have that kind of money to spend. And most importantly of all, to an extent, Carlton and the Broadcasting Act were right. ITV could only survive in the modern age alongside amoral and all-powerful entities like Sky by pooling its resources. Now, this didn't have to mean two companies devouring the rest and then merging, but sadly that was all they had the imagination for. Well, that and repeats of Robin's Nest.
Just try pushing me under. Try taking me to the brink. I'm a one-hit wonder.
just a place to cut the deck and make a trade from concert hall to cabaret and let the blue sky in and let the blue sky in.
And on Showbiz UK tomorrow, news of Keanu Reeves. Paul Ross talks about battered husbands, and Sharon Davis presents her first ever tour.